There's a kind of grief that has no funeral, no casseroles left on your doorstep, no cards in the mailbox, no one sitting beside you and saying, "I'm so sorry for your loss." I know this because I am living inside that grief right now, at 73 years old. While my heart is still beating and my coffee is still hot, and the sun still comes through my kitchen window every morning the same way it has for decades. My name is Margaret. I'm 73 years old, and I have begun mourning a life I have not yet finished living. I want to be careful here because I know how that sounds. I am not dying, not in any way the doctors have told me about anyway. I'm not depressed, at least not in the clinical sense. I wake up most mornings without dread. I still laugh at things. I still love my garden and my granddaughter and the particular smell of a used bookstore. But somewhere in the last few years, something shifted in me so quietly, so gradually, that I almost didn't notice it happening. And then one afternoon, I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror and I realized, truly realized in my chest, not just in my head, that the woman looking back at me was a stranger living in my house. Not an unpleasant stranger, but a stranger nonetheless. That was the beginning of what I've come to call my living grief, and I've spent a long time trying to find the right words for it, because I don't think I'm the only one who carries something like this. I grew up in a small town in central Pennsylvania, the youngest of 4 children, in a family where money was always a little tight and love was always a little complicated. My mother was the kind of woman who worked hard at everything and expressed affection, mostly through action, through ironed shirts and homemade soup and driving you 45 minutes to your piano lessons without ever once complaining about the gas. My father was quieter, more interior. He read constantly and had opinions about everything and softened with age in a way that made me love him more at 60 than I ever did at 16. I watched both of them get old. I watched my mother's hands, those capable, no-nonsense hands, begin to shake. I watched my father's voice go thin and reedy, the way voices do when the body starts conserving its resources. I watched them become diminished versions of themselves, and I thought what most people think when they're young enough to still think it. That will not be me. Not because I thought I was exceptional, but because the young are constitutionally incapable of truly believing in their own eventual smallness. It's a mercy, I think, that they can't. The world would grind to a halt otherwise. But I am not young anymore. I'm married at 26, which felt late at the time, and feels almost comically early now. His name was David, and we built a life together that was ordinary in all the ways that matter, and extraordinary in all the ways that are hardest to explain. We raised 2 children, a son and a daughter, in a house with a leaky basement and a backyard big enough for a vegetable garden that I have maintained in one form or another for over 40 years. David died 6 years ago, quickly, in the way that feels merciful until you're the one left behind, and then it feels like nothing but abandonment. I say that without bitterness now, though it took me a long time to get here. After he died, I rebuilt myself. That's the word I kept using in those first years. Rebuilt. I took a watercolor class. I started walking 4 miles a day. I became closer with my daughter, Ellen, in a way we both needed and neither of us had known how to initiate while David was alive. I got quieter inside my own head. I thought, at 67, 68, that I had arrived at something, some version of wisdom or peace or acceptance that the self-help books had always promised was waiting for me on the other side of loss. And then the other grief started, the one I didn't have a name for. It crept in around the edges. It started, I think, with small social moments that left me feeling invisible in a way I couldn't quite account for. A dinner party where I noticed that the conversation seemed to route around me the way a river roots around a rock. Not intentionally, not cruelly, but simply because I was stationary and the current had somewhere to be. A visit with my son's family where the grandchildren were sweet and distracted, and I sat on the couch, feeling like a prop in someone else's living room. A doctor's appointment where the young physician, she couldn't have been 35, spoke to me in the particular gentle, slightly elevated tone you use with someone you assume needs things repeated. None of these things were dramatic. None of them were worthy of complaint, even to myself. And yet each one left a small deposit of something heavy in my chest, and over time those deposits accumulated into a weight I couldn't ignore. I am not the person I thought I would be. That is the sentence at the center of all of this, and I need to sit with it for a moment, because it is more complicated than it looks. I do not mean that I am disappointed in my life. I genuinely don't. I mean something stranger and harder than that. I mean that I carried inside me, for most of my adult years, an image of the woman I was becoming, a future Margaret, wiser and more settled and more herself than the current version, and I assumed, the way you assume the next town is just over the next hill, that I was always moving toward her, that one day I would arrive, that one day I would look in the mirror and recognize, with some quiet satisfaction, that I had finally become who I was always supposed to be. That future, Margaret had silver hair, but she wore it like a choice, not a surrender. She had laugh lines, but they arranged themselves around her eyes in a way that suggested a life fully inhabited. She was someone people listened to at dinner parties, not because she dominated the conversation, but because she had earned, through decades of living, a particular quality of presence. She was warm without being needy. She was wise without being smug. She had read all the books she meant to read, and she knew at last what she believed about God and death and the nature of love. I am 73 years old, and I have not become her. I am still, in ways that genuinely surprise me, figuring things out. I am still, in ways that embarrass me a little, insecure about things that should not matter. I am still lonely in the particular way I have always been lonely, not from lack of company, but from the persistent feeling that the full interior version of myself has never quite made it all the way into the room. I still don't know what I believe about God. I still haven't read all of Proust, and at this point I think we can both admit that I am never going to. And the woman in the mirror, she is not who I expected. She is older than she feels on the inside. There's a disconnect there that I suspect many of you know, though we don't often say it out loud. My body has aged on its own schedule, indifferent to my feelings about the matter. My face has rearranged itself. My hands look like my mother's hands. My voice, when I hear it recorded, sounds like someone's grandmother, which I am technically, though it startles me every time. I don't say any of this to complain about aging. I understand the alternative. I understand in a way that grief has made very concrete that these years are a privilege, but understanding something intellectually and digesting it emotionally are two entirely different processes, and I think we do a disservice to older people when we collapse those two things into one, when we say, well, you should be grateful, as though gratitude and grief are mutually exclusive, as though you cannot be thankful for your life and still feel the loss of its earlier forms. Because that is what I am grieving. Earlier forms of myself. I am grieving the young woman who walked into her first professional job in the autumn of 1975 and felt for the first time like a person the world was going to take seriously. I am grieving the mother of young children, the one who was necessary in that urgent, constant, physically exhausting way that I complained about at the time and would give a great deal to feel once more. I am grieving the version of myself who still had David. Not just David himself, though of course I grieve him separately and always will, but the version of me that existed inside that marriage, that was witnessed and known by him in a way no one else will ever quite know me again. There is a particular loss in that last one that I want to speak to carefully, because I think it is one of the most profound and least discussed griefs of aging. When you have lived with someone for decades, they hold a version of you that only they can see. They carry your younger faces, your earlier voices, the arguments you had in 1987, and the vacation where everything went wrong and then turned out fine and became a story you told for 30 years. When that person dies, all of that goes with them, and you become, in some sense, newly untethered from your own history. The curator of your life is gone. What remains is only the version of you that still exists in the present tense, aging, changed, made strange by time. I have been sitting with all of this for several years now, and what I want to tell you is that I have not resolved it. I don't think it resolves. I think that is actually the important part. We are a culture that wants grief to have an arc. We want the stages, the processing, the breakthrough, the morning when you wake up and something is lifted. And sometimes grief does move that way. The grief I felt after David died has changed over 6 years in ways that feel, if not like healing exactly, then like weathering. Like the way wood weathers, not restored, but transformed into something that has its own particular beauty, precisely because of what it has been through. But this grief, the living grief, the grief of watching yourself change and recede, of mourning the you that you expected to be, this one doesn't arc the same way, because it's ongoing. Every year adds a new layer. Every year the future Margaret recedes a little further, and the present one becomes a little more undeniable. And here's what I have found, sitting inside that, not fixing it, but living alongside it. There's something that happens when you stop waiting to become yourself. When you release, really release, the image of the future version who was going to have it all figured out. What you are left with is this version, imperfect, unfinished, still confused about Proust and God and the nature of love, but also genuinely here, present in a way I don't think I managed to be when I was busy becoming. I notice more now, not because I'm wise, but because I have fewer places to be in my imagination. The future used to take up a great deal of space in my inner life, plans and projects and the ongoing renovation of the self. Now it takes up less, and what fills that space instead is the present, which turns out to be quite full if you let it be. My granddaughter is 7 years old. Her name is Clara, and she has her father's dark eyes and her great-grandmother's stubbornness, and she has decided that I am, in some category she has invented and never explained, her person. When she visits, she follows me around the house in a way that her parents find mildly alarming. She wants to know what I'm doing and why and whether she can help. She wants to sit with me while I do the most boring, ordinary things, while I fold laundry, while I water the plants, while I read in the afternoon quiet. She has no agenda. She is simply drawn, for reasons neither of us could articulate, toward my company. I am not certain what she sees when she looks at me. I am not the version of Margaret I expected to offer the world. But I am the only one I have, and she seems to find it sufficient, and on my better days, I am trying to do the same. I want to say something to you now if you are somewhere in your later years and you recognize what I've been describing. If you have stood in front of your own mirror with that same strange sense of displacement. If you too are carrying some private grief for a self that didn't quite arrive, a future that turned out to be only a future, which is to say that it turned out to be the present, which is to say that it turned out to be this. You are not doing it wrong. That's the thing I most want you to know. There is no correct way to navigate the late chapters of a life, and the expectation that you should have arrived somewhere specific by now, some destination of peace or wisdom or self-knowledge. That expectation was always a story we told ourselves to make the journey feel like it was going somewhere. The journey was always just the living. The destination was always going to be this ordinary, unfinished, still surprising day. I'm 73 years old. I've not become who I thought I would be, and I've begun to think that is not the tragedy it once seemed. The woman I thought I would be was always a projection, a future that my younger self invented to make sense of the present. She was never real. What is real is this kitchen, this coffee, this particular quality of morning light, and the fact that I am here to notice it. That doesn't stop the grief. I want to be honest about that. The grief is real, and it visits often, and some days it sits with me all morning like an uninvited guest who has learned their welcome anyway. But I have also found that grief and gratitude are not enemies, that you can mourn something and still love what remains, that the disappeared versions of yourself are not entirely gone. They're part of what made this version, this imperfect, unfinished, still here version, possible. Some nights I sit in the backyard after dark and I think about all the women I have been, the girl in the small Pennsylvania town, the young professional in her autumn coat, the mother, the wife, the widow, the gardener, the student, the grandmother who is, according to Clara, someone's person. They're all in me, all still present the way old photographs are present. Not the thing itself, but evidence that the thing was real. I am grieving a life I am still living, and I am learning slowly that grief is not the opposite of living. Sometimes it is the proof of it. If any of this has reached you today, I hope you'll carry it gently. Your grief for your own vanished selves is not self-pity. It is love turned inward toward the long and complicated story of who you have been. And that story is not over. which means the grief is not failure. It is just what it feels like to still be here, paying attention, at the end of a long and real and genuinely irreplaceable life. I'm Margaret. I'm 73, and I think most days that is enough.